Good day, everybody. This is Chris, and I'm going to be talking about today is a little review for the paramedic class I'm currently teaching. We're going through our medicine block and talking about endocrinology. So I wanted to go ahead and review some of the basic endocrine disorders that we've talked about thus far, and we'll also talk a little bit about the hormones involved in the endocrine system. Before I talk about all of that proper, I want to just make sure that everybody's on the same page as to what we're talking about, the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a way of controlling or influencing other influencing processes within the body. And so it's sort of the intuitive question I think that comes up is, well, what's the difference? What's a fundamental difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system? And in fact, the difference is a little muddy because ultimately the nervous system, particularly the central nervous system, has most of the control over the endocrine system. But if we kind of want to characterize and classify things, the way that I think about it is the following. If I have let's just say that I have a neuron here, and this is coming from the nervous system, obviously, and that neuron ends in an axon, and I have some target tissue here. The nervous system wants to affect some tissue here, so I'll just draw like a little block of tissue. The nervous system does that by, of course, an action potential travels down the axon, it gets to the terminal axon, and it releases neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are released directly onto a receptor. Maybe it's a nicotinic or a muscarinic or an alpha or a beta, metabotropic, an ionotropic, whatever the receptor is, it's released, it influences that receptor in some way. And through the interaction with that receptor, other actions occur either along the membrane of the cell, if we're talking about membrane channels, or if we're talking about a metabotropic receptor, some sort of pathway that's being activated or inhibited within the cell, depending on what's going on. But the big picture view of this is that the nervous system is more or less a direct control mechanism. That is to say that the nervous system controls processes directly. It doesn't, a neuron goes directly and it dumps neurotransmitters directly onto a receptor. Now we can contrast that to the endocrine system. So let's just say that I have a gland here, and this gland contains molecules of something called a hormone. And interestingly enough, hormones in some cases can be the same as neurotransmitters. For example, you can have the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and we call it a neurotransmitter when it's released from the terminal end of an axon and onto receptors. But let's say that same norepinephrine is then released from a gland. We call that a hormone. And the fundamental difference is that instead of releasing whatever chemical or substance we're talking about directly onto a receptor, the typical thing that happens in the endocrine system is I have a gland that secretes a hormone, and that hormone is then typically going to be secreted into the circulation, the circulatory system. And then the circulatory system, I'll just kind of draw this down, and maybe I have my tissue down here, my target cell down here with a receptor on it. And the circulatory system will then circulate the hormones to wherever their targets are. So the endocrine system is more of an indirect way of control, or of influencing, if you want to look at that, versus the nervous system, which is really a direct way of controlling things. So if once we kind of get that down, then we can kind of understand the endocrine system a little better. And the way that I think about the endocrine system, and hopefully this will become a little more obvious as we go along, is the endocrine system. I just think of micromanagement, micromanaging. All right, I just think of a micromanager because that's really what's going on with the endocrine system, and that kind of helps take some of the scariness of the complexity out of it when you think of the endocrine system as just being a whole bunch of micromanagement going on. So let's go back here. I've got kind of a picture. Well, I do have a picture drawn, and what I want to do is I want to talk about some of the major hormones that are produced. Of course, hormones are produced, actually, I shouldn't say produced, but they are secreted by glands. And what I want to do is I want to talk about kind of the master control, if you will, for many of the endocrine processes that occur. And actually, a lot of people will say that the pituitary gland, which I've drawn down here, the pituitary gland is quote unquote the master gland. But we need to be very careful when we talk about the pituitary gland, because the pituitary gland actually sits right under a structure within the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is actually in control. Okay, the hypothalamus is actually what controls the pituitary gland. And if you look at the pituitary gland, you have two lobes. You have the anterior lobe, which is right here. So you have the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and then you have the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So I have anterior and I have posterior. Now the interesting thing is the hormones for the posterior pituitary gland are actually produced by neurons within the hypothalamus. So these little green circles here are the soma, the cell bodies for these neurons, and then the hormones rather are produced in these neurons, and then they travel down this little pathway into the posterior pituitary gland, where they are stored in the terminal axons of these neurons. So really, the posterior pituitary gland is just nothing more than an area where hormones are stored. It's just more or less just a tool for the hypothalamus. Now, the anterior pituitary gland, however, is a little bit more autonomous in that it has cells within it that can produce hormones. But those cells will not release hormones until the hypothalamus tells it or signals for the anterior pituitary to release hormones. So the hypothalamus actually has to tell the anterior pituitary gland to do that. And what happens is the hypothalamus gland will excrete what are known as tropic hormones. Let me just write that. Tropic hormones, and these tropic hormones then are circulated from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary, and they signal for the anterior pituitary to release hormones. So you can already start to see some of this micromanagement going on, where I have a hormone that tells another gland to secrete a hormone, which tells another gland to secrete a hormone, and so on. So there's a lot of micromanagement going on here. So now let's just talk about some of the major, I'm not going to talk about every one, but I'm going to talk about the major hormones that we've talked about in class so far. So let's go ahead and start talking about the posterior pituitary hormones, and these include oxytocin. These include oxytocin and ADH, which is anti-diuretic hormone. This is sometimes called vasopressin as well. That's vasopressin is autonomous with, or not autonomous, synonymous rather, with anti-diuretic hormone. So oxytocin and ADH are some of the major posterior pituitary hormones that we've talked about. Oxytocin, of course, acts upon the uterus primarily, causes uterine contractions, which can be helpful when we talk about labor and delivery. And then it's actually a medicine that we can manufacture and we can give to treat uterine bleeding following a delivery. Anti-diuretic hormone, ADH, of course, if you think about it, it's anti-diuretic, so where is it going to work? Well, it is going to work on the kidneys, okay? And anti-diuretic hormone works on the kidneys, and it is literally that, anti-diuretic. It prevents us, or it keeps us from losing water. It tells the kidneys to hold on to water. That really is the function of anti-diuretic hormone, is to hold on to water. Tells the kidneys to hold on to water. Oxytocin, of course, involves stimulation of the uterus. All right, so I'll draw that there. Now let's go ahead and talk about the anterior pituitary hormones, the major ones. So the anterior pituitary hormones include TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, which stands for Adrenal Corticotrophic Hormone, ACTH. You also have FSH, and I'm going to group these two together, FSH/LH. FSH is a follicle stimulating hormone, LH is luteinizing hormone. And then we have GH, which is a growth hormone. TSH, we'll start there. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, as you might imagine, acts upon the thyroid. TSH tells the thyroid to release another hormone. So TSH stimulates the thyroid. All right, stimulates the thyroid, and TSH tells the thyroid to release yet another set of hormones, thyroxine, and there are two general types. There's the T4 and the T3, and these are the major hormones of metabolism. The thyroxine is what helps maintain an adequate level of overall metabolism in the body. So here you have this really complicated system. You have the hypothalamus releasing trophic hormones, which tell the anterior pituitary gland to release TSH, which then in turn tells the thyroid to release T3 and T4, and then T3 and T4 are involved in overall metabolism. So again, it's just this little process of micromanagement. Adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH. Well, that should come as no surprise that it acts on the adrenal gland, and ACTH tells the adrenal glands to secrete another type of hormone, a class of hormones called the steroids, and the typical hormone that we talk about there is cortisol. But this really involves the production of mineral and glucocorticoids. So again, hypothalamus, trophic hormones, anterior pituitary gland, adrenal corticotrophic hormone acts upon the adrenal gland to secrete cortisol. FSH and LH are secreted, and they act upon the sex organs, and they are involved in the development of sexual characteristics, sexual maturation, and so on. And then growth hormone, or GH, is just that. It's involved in overall growth and development. Now that we've talked about kind of the whole pituitary, the hypothalamic pituitary connection with all the hormones, I just want to talk about something else real quick, and that is the pancreas down here. The pancreas, not only does it secrete digestive enzymes like lipases and protease enzymes that help us digest primarily proteins, but the pancreas is also an endocrine. It functions as an endocrine organ as well. And within the pancreas, you have what are called islets of Langerhans cell clusters. You have what are called islets of Langerhans. And within those islets, you have three general types of cells we'll talk about. You have your alpha cells, you have your beta cells, and I believe you have what are called the delta cells. The alpha cells secrete a hormone called glucagon, glucagon, and glucagon acts primarily in the liver down here, and glucagon stimulates the liver to break glycogen down into glucose. So this is a way of maintaining steady levels of blood sugars by telling the liver to break glycogen down into glucose. The beta cells secrete another hormone called insulin, and everybody pretty much knows what insulin is. Insulin is a hormone that helps facilitate the diffusion of glucose into the cells. And then the delta cells actually secrete another kind of hormone called somatostatin, which is somewhat similar to growth hormone. All right, somatostatin, which is somewhat similar to growth hormone. It actually has some. It is actually really important clinically as far as paramedic school goes. When we talk about treating GI bleeds, there are some medications that are derived from this that I'll be talking about in more detail in the gastrointestinal block. But these are kind of the major players that we've talked about thus far. Now, there are many other types of hormones that we haven't talked about specifically, but we've talked about in other classes, like renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, which are all very important in maintaining vascular tone and water and electrolyte balanced. The thymus gland and thymosin, which is important particularly in younger people when we talk about the maturation of the T lymphocytes. But these are the major hormones that we've talked about, and many of the more common metabolic or endocrine disorders come from an imbalance of one or more of these hormones. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Hopefully you found that helpful, and as always, thanks for listening and hang in there.